pleasure to introduce Nicole Ardoin, Assistant Professor of School of Education in the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University, and Jason Morris, Vice President of the External Affairs and Programs at NatureBridge. And they're here to talk about some of the research they're working on and some of the bulletins that they're creating in order to back up what we all know from our experiences in the field. And so I welcome them to the stage.
I think each of us in the room here today is probably here because we've seen that spark. We've had those incredible stories and those incredible one-on-one experiences with children in the field, or perhaps each one of us has had one of those experiences. And so I could stand here for the next 20 or 25 minutes and share those kinds of stories. But what I was asked to do today was to come and share some of the research-based evidence that we have also about how and why we know that environmental education works. So the outcomes of interest that I've been asked to speak to today include those of academic performance, classroom management, student engagement, school culture, and student attitude toward environment and sustainability, many of which are important to those of us who work in classroom settings. I'd like to also step back a bit to talk about that this is important not only to those of us who work in classroom settings, but also to Californians more broadly. Last year, I don't know how many of you saw this poll that was run by the Public Policy Institute of California, where we had the ability to ask some more general questions about environmental education. And in this poll, we asked two questions about environmental education specifically. One was, do you think that environmental education should be taught at your local school? And the answer was a resounding yes. This answer held true across age of respondents, gender, race, education levels, whether people were renters or owners, whether people were citizens of the U.S. or not, people with or without kids. We also asked people how important they thought it was that their local K-12 school included environmental education. And again, across the board, people said it's important or very important. So this is something about which people in our communities care deeply. This suggests that those of us who are sitting in this room have the opportunity to connect with not only parents in our communities, but other community members. People recognize that environmental education is an important part of educating young people for the challenges and opportunities that are coming forward. And I think, as Sid just suggested, this is an integral part of preparing children for the workforce of today and tomorrow. So the first outcome of interest that I wanted to talk about is academic performance. And I think this is one of the most challenging outcomes to talk about, because when we think about environmental education, it's one of these issues that is so kind of tied into so many other elements of education. It's very difficult to pull environmental education from what else happens in a classroom setting. And I think it's a very clunky instrument when we think about something like standardized testing, and how does standardized testing relate to something like environmental education. With that disclaimer, I will go on to say that there have been a number of studies that have attempted to do this. One of the most famous, and one with which I'm sure a number of you are already familiar, is Jerry Lieberman's work looking at the State Education and Environment Roundtable. And I'll come back to the study several times because it's one that's quite well known. It actually has two parts to it, and I'll start with mentioning the first part, which is that there was a 2005 study done in 8 California elementary schools. And this was actually a quite well-designed study because it included 4 schools that used an environment-based curriculum. So they called this the environment as an integrating context. So this is an infusion approach where they included environmental education in all different subjects. And then they compared it against 4 schools that used more traditional methods. They examined standardized testing scores for 2nd through 5th graders over a 5-year period. And in 42% of the cases, they found that students from the environmental education schools, or the schools that used environment as an integrating context, scored significantly higher on standardized tests. This is the California STAR test, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, than the students from the non-environmental education schools in the traditional subjects of reading, mathematics, language, and spelling. Now, I'll come back to the environment as an integrating context study because they also looked at this across a number of states throughout the United States, which is also quite interesting when they compared it across a number of other areas, not only in standardized testing. But I know that, again, when you're thinking about those of you who are district administrators or school administrators, you think about this. Standardized testing is certainly one of the areas of academic performance in which many of us are very interested. Another study in the state of Washington that used standardized test scores as a metric looked at more than 600 eighth graders from 20 schools during the 2002 and 2003 school year, and found that students from schools with rigorous environmental education programs scored significantly higher on mathematics and writing state tests than students from schools with the traditional curriculum. And they note that their study illustrates that students with EE programs can perform at least the same level as well as higher on many of these areas that are of interest. And this is refuting the claim that a lot of people feel that doing environmental education actually takes away from the basics. And the argument would be that environmental education can really elevate the basics to a different level. And the suggestion here is that when we think about the crisis that occurs in taking time away from something, I think that was Craig who mentioned earlier, there's a sense that doing something like environmental education takes time away from the traditional curriculum. And the argument here would be that it actually enriches the traditional curriculum. So it provides an opportunity for students to become interested and engaged. A lot of the area of interest at Stanford currently, in particular my research group, is trying to think about what is the role of interest and what's the role of sparking student engagement and interest and getting kids really excited about what they're learning. And I think environmental education provides an opportunity almost like no other to do that. It provides this authentic engagement not only in the curriculum in a school setting, but also getting kids outside, getting their hands in the dirt if you have a school garden, getting them to go out to a local park or a local environment, getting them in the community to do something authentic in a way that no other learning opportunity can do. This is a study of schoolyard habitats in Texas, and many of you might be familiar with National Wildlife Federation's Schoolyard Habitat Program. They've actually done a number of studies of this, and this is just one particular example that was published in the peer-reviewed literature. And what we've done in this is to try to look across the peer-reviewed literature, but there also are a number of studies that are published in the gray literature, so that's what we call evaluation studies. But this is one that looked at more than 306 students across the Schoolyard Habitat Program, and I'm emphasizing here that they significantly increased mathematics scores. So that's not necessarily something you would think of. In the United States in particular, we often think of science scores. But I'd like to emphasize with this that you can also think about other subjects besides science. This is also a place where I'd like to pause and mention that the United States is actually somewhat unique in thinking of linking environmental education only with science. And we've done a number of studies, there have been a number of studies done internationally that finds that environmental education is actually linked in many countries around the world more heavily with civics and civic studies, and that's perhaps not surprising when you think about environmental education as actually being very broad. So again, in this one, they were really trying to look at mathematics, but you can think about environmental education as being much broader than science education. Another example from Texas, and again looking at school gardens, a slightly larger study. So they've got 647 students, again in elementary grades, third, fourth, and fifth graders. This is a large study, and here they're looking at science scores. Another area I'd like to mention that I think is incredibly important, and I've just mentioned the importance of interest. And this is something we're measuring right now with a grant from the Moore Foundation and working in conjunction with NatureBridge. And Jason, again, is here from NatureBridge today. But we're trying to get to this notion of student engagement, which in our work we're calling this a slippery concept. So the slippery concept of student engagement is operationalized in many different ways. So when we think about student engagement, we think about things like increased interest in school, increased interest in learning, which is something that's really challenging to not only to measure, but also challenging to see. I think, again, this gets back to the point of seeing kids' eyes light up, but how do you actually measure kids' eyes lighting up? How do you actually, you can tell the anecdote about it, but how do you report that back to an administrator? How do you report that back on a standardized test? It doesn't actually, that's something that's very hard to measure in a bubble and a dot and then report back to a state level. How do we think about something about it, the effects on critical thinking and motivation? How do we think about how this translates into kids applying to college or to choose to go into a career in science or engineering or in environment in that case? I look at my students at Stanford, and it's very hard for them to think about, how do they actually quantify that spark that got them interested in environment in the first place? So where does student engagement come into this? So there are a few studies that illustrate some of these kinds of student engagement outcomes. One example comes from an urban ecology program in Boston Public Schools. And this is an urban ecology program that was a field-based program that specifically was designed to engage underrepresented minority audiences, including minorities and female students in real-world hands-on science. And this is, again, as Sid mentioned, this is a particular place in the science and engineering and environmental education pipeline where we tend to lose a lot of students. And I also emphasized in this that they used a particular scale that I think is a really interesting one. It's called the I want to be a scientist scale. And as someone who dropped out of the kind of science and environmental world myself at about this age, this is kind of the middle school age, I can see that this is a particularly critical time. So I find this study really interesting in that they found that through this program that was designed to emphasize engaging interest in science, better understanding of the scientific method, and improved sense of environmental stewardship, particularly with these middle school students, they actually found that there was a significant rise in interest among this population. This is another study that highlights student engagement using the environment as an integrating context model. So that's one I mentioned earlier, one that was the term that was coined here in California. And this is applied in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is an area in which I've done quite a bit of work. And again, they were trying to look at how did they take this middle school context, again, a really critical time at which we find a lot of students, in particular young women, in particular minority students, tend to fall out of that science, engineering, environment pipeline. And they were trying to look at, is this a really an effective way to keep children in that pipeline? And they found that student engagement and learning was significantly more positive for students who were described as being in classrooms where the environment as an integrating context was greatly emphasized. This was an effective way to really keep those students currently engaged. And again, this is a program actually with which I'm personally familiar. This is one that was a place-based education program, which is why it's important to note the Chesapeake Bay context. Environment-based education is another term that you'll hear, and again, that's got the place-based education piece of it. 11 Florida high schools, 400 kids, and this, again, environment-based learning significantly increased critical thinking and achievement motivation. And this is looking at a program in Hawaii. I realize I am flying through some of these because I want to get to some of the later outcomes that might be of interest as well. This is looking at Hawaii. The finding here was that they were looking at critical thinking skills. Another interesting thing about this program is this is a culturally based program. So they're looking at critical thinking skills among students who participated in this program. And finally, this is an interesting program. You can look at the N on this is really shocking. This is more than 18,000 high school students in Alaska. This is looking at dropout rates in students who participated in a program that was place-based, cultural, and ecological program. And they found that dropout rates decreased among those students. Classroom management is always an issue. As someone who has been in a classroom and has dealt with this, I also have seen, I actually was corresponding with a colleague who was recently on an environmental education program and was noting that one of the challenges that can occur in field-based programs as well is thinking about classroom management. And a lot of this is linked as well to student engagement. So in this area, we're looking at outcomes of interest like group work, cooperation, and teamwork, as well as respect for other students. So in this, we think about the ability of environment as an integrating context to have a positive effect on students' abilities to work in group work settings and students' communication skills. So again, environment as an integrating context. The same study that we saw earlier, the Lieberman and Hoodie study, showed that more than 98% of survey respondents participating in these programs felt that there was a significant impact on group work and communication skills. Some of you might be familiar with this study. This is a study done in California looking at residential environmental education programs in California, finding that the impacts on students' engagement around self-esteem, conflict resolution, relationships with peers, problem solving, and motivation to learn, as well as behavior in class, was improved through participating in residential outdoor education programs. This relates to a mountain school classroom in New Hampshire. And the benefits of participating in this were increased class cohesion as well as improved teacher and student relationships. and a study in South Carolina looking at environment-based education. You can see that you can kind of go on and on looking at the benefits of these kinds of programs. So behavior referrals decreased by 56%, suspension hours decreased by 75%, and absenteeism decreased by 16%. So these are all benefits of participating in these kinds of programs that really are designed to engage trust among students as well as trust with students and their mentors. And having done programs last summer myself with students in the field, it's really incredible to see how that relationship forms between the teacher and the students in a very different way than it occurs in a classroom setting, and how that can then be transferred back into the classroom setting. School culture, when we think about school culture, again, it's calling on these same principles as were mentioned in the last kinds of studies. It's thinking about relationships and trust. And this is a study that's looking, this is the EIC study again, looking at educators' enthusiasm and commitment to teaching, thinking about the effect of the educator's relationship working with students and colleagues, and then thinking about the civility that occurs among the students working not only with each other but also with their teachers. This is the American Institute of Research study that I mentioned earlier, thinking about how long does this actually last. So they found that 6 to 10 weeks after participating in these outdoor education programs, the cooperation and conflict resolution actually lasts. And the Mountain School program also found that increased class cohesion and improved teacher-student relationships also continues after participation in these kinds of programs. And finally, I'd like to end by discussing the attitude toward environment and sustainability. I don't want to emphasize this too much with this group because I think part of the reason you're here is that you believe in the importance of attitudes toward environment and sustainability coming out of something like environmental education. I think this is the kind of thing that this is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about environmental education. So I think this is kind of a natural outcome of these kinds of programs. But of course, because we think of this as so natural, I think it's really critical to always measure, are we reaching these outcomes when we design programs for these sorts of outcomes. And as someone who works a lot in evaluation, I always emphasize that it's critical to think about, are we reaching the goals that we set for ourselves related to attitudes toward environment and sustainability. This is a study that was actually run by a friend and colleague of mine who worked in New Haven, Connecticut. And any of you who are familiar with the New Haven, Connecticut setting know that this can be a really challenging setting in which to work. I think that this study run by Leanne Fissman, who was a doctoral student at MIT at the time, is a really interesting one because she used not only standardized test scores and standardized surveys, but she also used mapping with these students and ethnography and spent a lot of time with these students in the field to look at the impact of an urban environmental education program, an urban ecology program, on children's environmental awareness as well as their behaviors. And she found that their awareness of the local environment really skyrocketed just through their engagement in this environmental education program that was set in their urban setting. I think that's a really important reminder that it doesn't always need to be out away from people's home environment, that it can actually be set, and it can sometimes be even more powerful when set where kids are functioning on a day-to-day basis. Again, this is an example of the same study earlier, the Environment as an Integrating Context study in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That had incredibly powerful outcomes related to their environmental knowledge, attitudes, and stewardship behaviors, and again, set deeply in their own home place. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is a really interesting one because it's got these really dense urban settings coupled with these incredible open spaces. And so this is the kind of place where you have the opportunity for kids to be able to experience open spaces and then draw that back to their own home environment. And in just a minute, I'll mention to you where some of the opportunities I think are for looking at the programs that are represented here, and then thinking about your school settings and thinking about where can we link those two together. And this is one of those studies that found that the data they found here supports the conclusion that differences in these knowledge and stewardship behaviors among students who attended the same school strongly was influenced by their teachers' curricular instructional choices. So I think this suggests that the teachers and the administrators in your schools have an incredibly powerful role to play in making these links for the students between their local environment and the opportunities for engagement in their own local community. And finally, I'd like to end by suggesting that what happens in students' lives as young people has an incredibly powerful effect on what happens in their lives as adults. You know, I think we often mistakenly make the argument that we should focus on young people because they're going to be the decision makers of tomorrow. And yet I look around this room and I see the decision makers of today. And I see the decision makers of today making incredibly important decisions today. And so because of that, you know, the research that I do and the research that my group does not only focuses on young people but also on adults. And I think it's really important to remember that communities are made up of young people and adults, and that all adults were once young people. Such as this one. This is part of a body of research called Significant Life Experiences Research, where we think about what were the significant life experiences that impacted you as a young person and continue to impact you as an adult, that help you to make better and good and better decisions about the environment. And what we know about this is that it's incredibly important for young people to spend time outdoors, to spend time with mentors, to have good guidance around good decision-making skills about the environment, to have a good, strong basis in science, in decision-making, in critical thinking skills. This is a study that suggested that experience with wild nature, and the wild is in quotes because wild can be everything from an open lot next to in a city all the way to spending time in Yosemite. So wild it's relative, but spending time in wild nature before the age of 11 has a strong impact on adult environmental behavior and attitudes. And this is one of a body of hundreds of studies that suggest the importance of spending time outdoors with a mentor. And each one of you sitting in this room is a mentor in some way, shape, or form. And I think each one of you in particular who is related to a school has a conduit to many other mentors for many other children. And so I think it's really important to remember that every single one of these studies that I've been citing here today has this incredible multiplier effect. So that's why I wanted to end with this study to suggest that what we're talking about here today is not just about kids in schools, but it's really about the health and well-being of all of our communities. And this is really, really powerful stuff. We have the power in our hands to make the world a much better place. And when I say that, I'm always cautious because I don't want to suggest that it's not already an incredible place. I just think that with the environmental issues that we're facing today, it's really the responsibility of all of us to take responsibility for what the world looks like tomorrow. So I'd like to suggest that the studies I've shown you today are just a small snippet, and I apologize for flying through them at a breakneck pace. They're just a small snippet of the hundreds of studies that I could have shown you that suggest that there are very real outcomes from environmental education, and that the evidence is incredible for the outcomes that we see from environmental education. There are many other outcomes I could have focused on, and in fact, many of these are of strong interest to me and to my research group and to many of my colleagues. In particular, I'm very interested in outcomes, as I've just mentioned, around civic engagement, around community leadership and the development of civic engagement skills. I'm very interested in health and well-being, and in fact, just yesterday spent the day with a researcher visiting from Germany who's specifically looking at health and well-being and how time spent in nature affects that. As I've mentioned, career choice and modeling, and we heard that earlier, the importance of thinking about career choices. Many other outcomes of interest related to environment-based education. So we could spend hours talking about this, and as mentioned, I'd be happy to share with you the bibliography of that, and Jason will talk about that in a minute, what we've started to do toward that end. I'd also like to suggest, though, that the jury is still out on many of these. While we know what the evidence base suggests, we also know that there are many other questions around what's the most effective sequence and structure for many of these programs. How do we best scaffold these experiences to bring them back to kids' everyday lives? How do we best engage families? And I think that's where many of you come in. You know your families and your schools much better than any of us researchers do. How do we best create the relevance for contemporary issues? Environmental issues are changing by by the day. So how do we best ensure that our programs are fresh and new and innovative? And how do we create the research to practice link? How do we ensure that the research that we're doing that can sometimes, as you've seen, take years to produce, how do we best ensure that that helps inform the work that you're doing? So while there's a great evidence base, there's still a lot more work to be done, and the best way that we can ensure that that happens is to continue this dialogue and ensure that those of you who are doing the work on the ground are continuing to talk to those of us who are trying to help provide the really strong evidence base for this. So I'd like to end there and thank you for your time, and to turn it over to Jason, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the efforts we're doing to keep this research to practice dialogue open.